the opinions that I express to you guys really only apply to the Santa Ana Regional Board. In many respects, I'm going to be talking about some of the state policies and requirements. Take that as being broadly applicable across the state. But some of the things I'm going to say, you want to take a little bit of grain of salt and don't necessarily go into San Diego and say, oh, Adam said this, right? Because it may not work there. Okay? So I want to talk to you real quick about the State Water Conservation Action. And I'm going to tell you about some of the things that the Regional Water Quality Control Boards have been doing about water conservation. Some of that's a bit of a misconception about what that really means, if it's really about water conservation or if it's about something else. And then I want to talk to you about some of the things that the water suppliers are being required to do, or that they've sort of chosen to do in order to meet the state's water conservation requirements. Again, there's 9 regional boards, and there's one state water resource control board. And the State Water Resources Control Board, they're sort of a policy setting body. They really sort of give a lot of direction, but they don't necessarily tell the regional boards exactly what to do. And the reason for that is that the different regional boards are faced with different issues. And so when the state legislature set up the regional boards, they really recognize this, and they basically set it up so that the regional boards are all based on hydraulic boundaries. So, here we are, we're in the Santa Ana region, Region 8, but our neighboring regions are Region 4, the LA region, and the San Diego region. And so between these 3 regions, we are a very, very highly urbanized watershed. So you can imagine some of the issues that we're faced with are definitely not going to be the same as what you might find up in Region 1. We have redwoods and that kind of thing going on here.
Which one is Sacramento in? Is that
Sacramento, honestly, I would say region, is it right? Region 5?
5.
I should know that, huh? So the State Water Resources Control Board, the most recent action that they took was Resolution 2015-0032. And this was basically after the governor issued the emergency mandates, or whatever they call it. But basically, you look at that resolution, and you find that it has 2 sets of general requirements. The first one is it has end-user requirements, and that has to do with the folks such as yourself. It also includes residential and commercial users, basically the customer, the water customer. Then it also has requirements that apply to the water supplier. And in California, we have water districts that are water suppliers, but we also have cities who run their own utility, their own water utilities. And so those cities and those districts will also have their own separate requirements in addition to the end user requirements. The thing to keep in mind about this order is that it is enforced by the state board. It is not necessarily going to be enforced by the regional boards. The governor did not give that authority. They didn't pass that down to the different regional boards. That doesn't mean that the regional boards won't get involved. There have been some cases where someone has had some complaints, and in some cases I've gone out to investigate the complaints of water use and abuse. But I don't have the authority to come out and issue findings or anything like that. I just report back our findings back to state board, then they do whatever that they think they need to do. So in some of the regional boards really don't even touch it. They don't want to get involved. And it's just, as with many government agencies, it's a staffing issue. The governor passed these things, they gave some authority to state boards, but the money didn't come with it either. So you can think that's a reasonable response. So I added these underlines, these statements I've underlined here. I'll tell you about that in a moment. But there's basically, if you're an end user, you're the person who's the residential user, the commercial user, or someone who's just basically going off someone's tap. You have 2 prohibited activities. The first one, as many of you know, is that the use of a hose that dispenses potable water to wash a motor vehicle, except where the hose is fitted with a shutoff nozzle, is prohibited. And the second one is the application of potable water to driveways and sidewalks is also prohibited. Now, as a regulator, as someone who also writes and enforces regulations, I think that these are very curiously written statements. As you notice, I've highlighted that the term motor vehicle, driveways, and sidewalks. So these are very, very specific requirements. And we can always guess as to why they're written that way. But I could easily take potable water, and use it to wash a building, and I would not be, you know, in violation of that requirement. Same thing with applying, I could take the water and apply it to a water fountain and still not be in violation of that requirement either. But keep in mind, these are end user requirements. These are things that are enforced directly by the state board on the end user. Now there's a couple of exceptions here. First one is that you can do these things if they're necessary to address an immediate health and safety need. And then the second one is that you can do these things again if you have to comply with the term or conditions and permit issued by a state or federal agency. Again, I underlined that it's state or federal agency. So the city may have a permit, term, or condition, or a county may have it, but that doesn't get you off the hook. It has to be a state or federal agency requirement. Keep in mind though that some agencies like county health, they enforce some of the state requirements, so it may come out of the mouth of a county staff person, but if they can tell you that they're enforcing a state or federal requirement, then you have to listen to that. So the water supply requirements are a bit more ambiguous, and I think this is where a lot of confusion comes out of it. The state established a bunch of reduction requirements, and they're basically to reduce the total water production by a very specific conservation standard, and that's applied to each of the different users. I don't recall if it's by county or what exactly, but it is based on a % monthly reduction, and it varies by the different water suppliers. It is as low as 4% reduction to as much as 30% reduction per month. Now, the reason why these numbers vary so widely is that because if you're a city or you have residents or end users who are already really efficient, the idea is that you shouldn't be burdened with having to have those people reduce it even further. So the guy who's up in Beverly Hills using about 1 million gallons a month is not going to have the same obligation as someone in Santa Ana who's using 200 gallons a month. So effectively, an efficient water user doesn't get penalized. They have a much lower reduction mandate on them. And so keep in mind though that this is about it as far as the state requirements go. The state left it up to the individual water suppliers to decide exactly how they're going to meet these things. And so different water suppliers have chosen different means of complying with these requirements. Okay, so how do they do this? What is their authority to the water suppliers? Their authority comes through their local ordinance, right? Just because a state issues some mandate to a city or something like that doesn't mean that the authority automatically comes with it. Every government agency, this is sort of government 101. One government agency cannot give another government agency authority, except for maybe Congress or something like that. It has to be a legislative action to give you an authority. Otherwise, you have to work through your own authorities. So a city doesn't get its authority from the state; it comes from the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So what the city has to do is they have to adopt an ordinance. And so again, this is every city operating under their own separate authorities and taking their own separate approaches. And those cities may do things like have a prohibition on certain discharges. They may limit irrigation entirely or partially. They may, or many actually believe are actually required to have tiered water conservation pricing now. But they can choose anything else that they think is going to work, as long as it fits within their authority. But the bottom line is that the methods are really up to the individual cities, and so you end up with a really wide diversity in approaches and how to meet those conservation requirements. So in the backdrop of this whole thing is something called the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System Permit. And this has been around for over 25 years, and it's part of the Clean Water Act, and is part of what's called the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System of Permits. And I was saying earlier that US EPA is the administrator of the entire program, but the Clean Water Act allows the EPA to delegate the authority to this program to the states. And so California is one of those states who has the authority to implement certain parts of the Clean Water Act. like Section 404 is dredge and fill. The Corps of Engineers does dredge and fill in the state of California. The state of California does not administer Section 404 permit. Specifically, this is 402 if anybody really cares. But 402 is the states do implement 402. But so this permit in particular, this MS4 permit, applies to public agencies that own or operate conveyances for stormwater. And these are your streets, your curbs and gutters, your ribbon gutters, your channels, drainage pipes, your sort of your traditional types of storm drain systems. So because of that, you can have actually different kinds of MS4 permittees. Obviously, you're going to have counties and cities, but you can also have universities, community college districts, and federal state hospitals. These last three are what we call Phase 2 permittees under the MS4 program. They're all relatively new. I think that permit's only been around for about 2 years, going on 3 years. And so, like, if you're going on to one of these if you have a customer on one of these properties and they have an MS4 permit, you shouldn't really expect a whole lot of sophistication from these guys. They've only been doing it for a little while, but nevertheless, they still have very, very similar requirements on them to meet the permit requirements. I'll get into that in just a second. Okay. So the main requirement, there's a ton of requirements on these permits. The permit I'm writing is something like 102 pages long, something like that. But a lot of requirements. Most of them are things that don't really affect you guys too much. There's one that someone brought up earlier that I hadn't even thought of, but we'll talk about it in a moment. The big one is that the permit requires that the cities and the counties, or the university, or whoever it is that's under the permit, has to effectively prohibit unauthorized non-stormwater discharges into the MS4. That's into the street gutters, into the storm drains, etc. What it boils down to is you cannot have any kind of commercial wastewater entering into this public system. Now the second one, no irrigation runoff, that might be kind of not applicable to you guys, but you just kind of have to recognize that that does kind of fall into the realm of water conservation. Kind of, but not really, because the MS4 permit is really about eliminating pollution. It's not really about water conservation. Water conservation is one way to eliminate pollution because you're just eliminating the vehicle to move that pollution into the water body, but nonetheless, it's not the principal driver to have these kinds of irrigation prohibitions. Nonetheless, the San Diego region and the LA region have adopted new permits that have prohibitions on irrigation runoff. Our region has not done that yet, but we do have a draft permit that does include it. We're sort of pressured into doing it because, you know, like I said, the state board, they like to have uniformity, consistency across the different permits. So does US EPA, because EPA is, since it's their program and we're just administering it on their behalf, they're looking over our shoulder to make sure that we're doing the things that they want us to do. So remember, this permit only applies to the dischargers that are named, and that's the cities and counties, not necessarily individual business owners and operators. Some of those guys have their own other permits, but that's a whole other topic there. But the cities and counties sort of, it kind of rolls downhill, right? It comes from the state, falls on the cities and counties, and then they come down and adopt their ordinances, and then they bring it to your doorstep, basically. So, as far as carrying this thing out, what is in place in the permit that sort of causes these guys to have to affect these prohibitions? Well, first of all, there's some general requirements for public outreach, not just for this issue itself, but for other things like pesticide use and fertilizers and that kind of thing. The cities and the counties do have a program for public outreach. They also have to have, this is the permit requirement, they have to have a progressive enforcement policy. You can call it whatever you want, 3 strikes, you're out. But basically it starts with a verbal warning, written notice, and if all else fails, a penalty amount, right? And that's sort of, I don't want to say it's universal, but that's sort of a policy that our office has as well. It's pretty unusual for us to come right out and issue a fine right off the bat on a discharge. Usually we'll want to give a verbal warning. Now, the one thing about verbal warnings is that we do record our interactions with the public. We expect the cities to do the same thing. The reason is because if you go into one city, you get a verbal warning, go to another city, get another verbal warning, go to another city, get another verbal warning. How is that effective? That doesn't accomplish anything. So what the permittees have to have is they have to have a way to track the mobile cleaners. And so there is a database. They populate it mostly with their business license database. And I'm sure that cities really like to aggressively enforce their business license requirements because of revenue issues. But that information does spill over into their mobile cleaner database. And that's how they track to see, well, this guy has had so many warnings, we need to step it up. Now, I'm the guy who's responsible for auditing these systems, auditing these processes. This has not been something that I've audited. It's definitely of interest to me to see if they're really using this database or not. I'm not guaranteeing anything, but if they're not using it, I'm the guy who's going to make sure that they are using it effectively.
Are you enforcing in your district the water discharge or the pollutant within the water?
Well, how do you separate the two?
Well, no, but I keep reading these, or what you were talking about, the discharge and the pollutants. So, take for instance, we use something to stop the contaminants and pollutants, but only water discharges to the storm.
Okay, what you're saying in regulator parlance is, well, if I treat the discharge, can I discharge, right? If I try to remove the
Yeah, that's the question.
No.
So zero
discharge. You cannot discharge that wastewater. I mean, if we were to issue a permit, we of course have requirements on you to do that. One of the big troubling things about issuing a permit for a wastewater discharge, if you're not a city, is that you would be subject to something called numeric effluent limitations, right? That means that you would have to have a very involved sampling program to make sure that your discharge is actually meeting those kinds of things. It's not, I mean, how do you scale that down to a business such as yours? It doesn't really work real well. It works fine if you're a major discharger like Coca-Cola or something like that, but if you're talking about a guy who's doing a one-day job or a two-day job and they're hit and gone, I mean, it's much easier just to prohibit the discharge because the cost of monitoring, for example, I want to say our previous industrial permit had something like the big 4, the big 5 that you had to monitor for total suspended solids, pH, et cetera, et cetera. And the cost of doing a single round of sampling is $600. And you have to do that twice a year. I mean, is that something that this industry would accept? I seriously doubt that. Yeah, actually, no. So, and that's just a practical decision that's been made. And so that's why, and frankly, we don't have a choice as a state agency because that is actually what's written in the federal regulations. And one of the big things about having federal regulations is this US EPA likes to see consistency across the state. Because if the states aren't consistent, what they end up doing, I mean, theoretically anyways, is they start to cannibalize business from one another. You have one, like, China versus the US, that kind of thing, where this, state just eliminates all their effective, regulations, another state implements them, then there's an unfair competitive advantage, then US EPA has to bring up handles.
So just to put a big blanket over this,
Yes.
to all of us, you would say, if we discharge a thin amount of water into the storm drain, we're breaking this rule.
Yes, and you'd be violating.
And anyone in general, not even mobile cleaners, but Johnny, whoever who throws water into the
Well,
curb
it
or
has to,
whatever.
there's some
anyways.
allowance for some common sense here.
No,
But
understood.
like here's a good example. Before we had the big push on the cities to do this kind of enforcement, we would actually issue fines for a restaurant owner who would dump a bucket of mop water in the alleyway in the back.
Wow.
That actually has happened.
I got that fine like 3 weeks ago.
Is that you? No, I'm talking like even before the cities were required to do it. So it's just kind of like the scale at which it happens, right? Because before we were leaning on the cities, our agency was the one doing that kind of thing. And now we lean on the cities, and so the city would have been the one that would have issued you that.
The city, yeah, on convention.
Yeah, and
Don't be window washing water.
yeah. It means wastewater discharge. We don't draw any really fine distinctions about what that means. It's wastewater. It has waste in it, so there you have it.
Can I ask you a question? Are you guys, so you're working in this region, or is your part of your region Long Beach, or is it Long Beach North?
No, I don't have Long Beach. Basically, I have Orange County. Long Beach is LA.
Are you guys using any, in the, stormwater treatment in the actual stormwater drains like Long Beach has? With the bins that go inside the drain and filter the water off the streets?
Wow, that's a whole nother element of the program, but it sounds to me like this is where this whole discussion is going. I wasn't planning to talking about that, but it sounds like it's worth talking about. So another requirement of the MS4 permit is that new development and significant redevelopment, don't ask me what that means, that's like another hour talk. But if you fall under one of these categories of new development or redevelopment, then you have to meet certain requirements for treating your runoff from your property, right? And so I'm sure many of you guys have come across a site that says, oh, we have an infiltration galleries underground, or we have these filters in place, or whatever is there. Again, if it's something that filters and treats and then discharges off-site, and even though your water may pass through that facility, it's still an unauthorized discharge. Now, if you have a discharge that goes into an infiltration system, where you're talking about it being filtered through the ground and going straight down to the groundwater, don't care. Because an NPDES permit is about surface waters. Groundwater is a whole other regulatory program. I'm not saying that we don't have requirements or concerns, but be honest, how much damage can 5 gallons of wastewater do from an intermittent discharge? We're not really concerned with that. We have other things to do. So, but as far as this NPDES permit program goes, if you have that discharge, even if it passes through and it actually makes it into a storm drain system, and then we don't have to prove that it actually got there, but if it could have gotten into a surface water body, then you would be in violation. So I'm going to talk a little bit more detail about what that means in the next slide. Okay? Let me get through this real quick though. So this table is just simply to compare the drought requirements against the MS4 requirements. So as I said earlier, the drought requirements were issued by the state board. The MS4 requirements, depending on if it's phase 2, they were issued by the state board or the regional boards. Okay, not every inch of California is covered by an MS4 permit. An MS4 permit only applies to your urban areas. Okay, so if you go out to some very rural city and you do a job, it's unlikely that you're going to find them under an MS4 permit. The drought requirements are implemented through a local ordinance as well as MS4 permit. Remember that the state leans on the city or the water supplier, and then they lean on everybody else, all their customers. The drought requirements are enforced on the public by the water suppliers, as I just said. MS4 permit requirements are enforced on the public by municipalities. But like I said earlier, a municipality, a city may also be a water utility. So what will happen is they'll kind of mix up those two objectives. They'll mix up their drought requirements with the MS4 requirements. And I've heard stories about a city inspector will come on and say, oh, you're violating the Clean Water Act by applying water to the concrete. That's not true. That's not the case at all. They're just kind of mixing things up. If you're applying water and it discharges, that definitely is, but just because you did and you vacuumed it up, well, that's water conservation violation. So they're two different things. Just keep that in mind. Doesn't really matter though if you're arguing with a guy now. I don't know. It's up to you guys to decide if you want to pick your battles or how you pick your battles there. The drought requirements are only temporary emergency regulations. I should say only. It is a big deal. But hopefully they're only going to be around for a few years. And on the other hand, the MS4 requirements, they've been around for going on 25 years. As a matter of fact, next month I believe will be 25 years. And they're going to be around for a long time. It will probably be around for at least another 25 years and beyond that. The drought requirements, obviously, their purpose is to conserve water. The MS4 requirements is to minimize pollution in the receiving water body by way of prohibition or numeric effluent limitations. The drought requirements, they apply to use of potable water, whereas the MS4 requirements apply to any discharge of any water that may contain waste. So you could use, in theory, you could use recycled water, and it sounds like some of you do. You could use that recycled water, not be in violation of the drought requirements, allow that recycled water to get off the property, and find yourself in violation of the MS4 permit requirements. So you have this onion, this multiple layers of regulations that are affecting you. And hopefully I'm not confusing you guys too much, but I hope that I can clear it up for you a little bit. Oops. Okay. So this is just a horrible slide. But anyways, the idea is to sort of illustrate to you guys that there's some parts of this system that we have that are pretty clear, right? You know that you cannot have a wastewater discharge under the MS4 permits requirements of the city. And you know that you cannot have motor vehicle washing without a shut-off nozzle. And you know that you cannot apply your water to the potable water to the driveway and sidewalk washing. What are you doing to conserve water? Well, that, again, that just depends on what the city's motivations are. A city that's under the 4%, falling on that 4% range of reduction requirement, they may be very lenient. Whereas if you're in a city that's falling on that high end, the 30%, the 36% range, they may be doing all kinds of stuff. And so just simply by crossing a jurisdiction, the rules change. And, frankly, that's not something that I can really speak to. I mean, that's not a problem that's for me to solve as a regional board staff person. Okay, so some practical guidance, I suppose. So I put down this, I title this slide is like, what do you do? What happens if you meet a regional board inspector in the field? What happens if you meet a water district person or a city or county person? So what is the goal of each of these individual people that you meet? What is my goal as a regional staff person? Well, my goal is to not have any wastewater discharge. Okay, so you can go ahead and wash what you want, just don't let it get off the property, right? On the other hand, the water district staff, their goal is water conservation, and that could be no discharge, no use of water whatsoever. That's really entirely up to them. The city has a mix. The city or the county has a mix, depending on if they're a water utility or not. So they may be saying, well, we want water conservation. They will definitely be saying that we don't want any wastewater discharge if they're under an MS4 permit. So what is regulated? Regional boards concerned about pollutants. Water district is worried about conservation, water use. The city, again, depending on if they're if they have a water utility, their concern is going to be pollutants and maybe water use if they're a water utility. So what is their enforcement authority? I can't really speak to what the authority is exactly for the water districts or the cities, but basically it boils down to local ordinances. And they will vary. Some of them may have come up with model language, so you may find some similarities, but the reality is that you have to be, it's sort of a bit of a trap. You don't know exactly what those ordinances say. I can tell you as a regional board inspector, I was saying that before we used to be the ones out there, knocking on people for having discharges. If we were to revert back to that policy, we have two tools under California Water Code. One of them is 13260, the other one's 13376. The only difference between the two is 13260 is waters of the state. 13376 was basically something we had to do to the water code in order to get approval from UAMCCEVents. That one specifically applies to discharges to waters of the U.S. From a practical standpoint, 13260, for me to take an enforcement action on 13260, requires that I have to give you a prior notice, hey, stop that. And if you stop, fine. If you don't stop, then we can come at you with a $5,000 fine up to, right? That's a ceiling. 13376, again, that's waters of the U.S. If I can show that your discharge might have reached waters of the U.S., I don't have to prove it again, then I can use 13376. I don't have to give you a warning. $10,000 is the maximum fine for that one. So now here's a principle, right? I'm not saying that this is like an official principle of regional boards or of anybody, but there is a principle that says in government that to achieve a certain goal, you should try to use the least intrusive method, something that's least intrusive on people's rights, right? Your money is your property rights, right? So it doesn't really make sense for us to go and use these authorities, 13376, 13260, unless a less intrusive method, going to the city, fails. So our policy is to refer the matter to the city, right? And if that fails, then we start talking about coming after a discharger with these more intrusive approaches. So, you know, everybody, all these different entities, the water staff, the city staff, county staff, they all have the ability to do fines. The water district staff and the city staff and the county staff, their fines are much, much less. You're talking hundreds of dollars. Don't ask me exactly how much. I've heard things like $100, as much as $500. So, so it is very, but it's far less damaging, and it still gets the point across, I think. And so why would we not go to that route instead of going to a much more, much bigger hammer with the state law, right? So those two entities, the water districts and the cities and counties, they would either issue you a warning or a penalty. Typically, they have a progressive enforcement policy, so you get a warning first, but I'm not guaranteeing anything, right? Because I don't represent those guys. Those guys can do whatever they want. If they are really, really strict about it, and that's entirely their right to be, they can come out straight up with a fine right off the bat if they want to do that.
Who enforces the fine?
All that is the city and the county. Whoever is going to issue the notice or the violation or whatever it is enforces that. So if it's coming out of us, you know, coming out of our office and we're citing 13260, 376, etc., we would be the ones administering that fine. Not usually, we haven't done it yet, not in a long time, but that's how it would be. Now the cities, they have their own individual ordinances. They would actually cite, you know, chapter 13.26, blah, 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 something like that. And they all are numbered in very different ways. You know, many of you guys probably work in many, many cities, and I can't imagine that's an easy thing to get to know those ordinances with any kind of intimacy. But nonetheless, it's something that you guys have to deal with, but not you. So, okay, as I said, you know, I take questions, comments, and insults. So.
Okay, were you here this morning when I did my talk?
No, sir.
I got a couple questions for you. We have been trying to work with local regulators and state regulators and the public and our own customers for a long time to explain that we are cleaners, we're not polluters. We don't create pollution in any way, shape, or form. What's in our heart, what we do for a living is cleaning. And in all honesty, that makes us your partners, because our job is to do exactly what you guys are trying to do, and that is to keep waterways clean, keep our spaces clean, keep everything clean. That's our job. Being that that's our job, and that puts us in a little different category from, say, the cement plant, whose job is to produce cement, and other place like the car parts place that has oil and stuff all over the ground where people go pick apart and things like that. Their job is not to keep the environment clean, but that's what we do. And as I've traveled across, I actually went up to Sacramento when the state rules were being made, and part of our plea to them was the reason that we got the health and safety exemption in the first place. And further, we talked to them about conservation and explained to them that with the power of pressured water, we use 58 times less water than someone with a hose does. So by nature, our entire industry is conserving water, just by the way that we use water. And so with that, we got very good results with those guys. And my question is, being that there is such a difference between what we do and what these other industries that are polluting do, we feel like we need to get together with you guys some way and work together, as opposed to feeling like we're in an adversarial position to where we're going to be in trouble for trying to accomplish exactly what you guys are trying to accomplish.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's really a matter of perspective. You know, the hard-nosed answer to that is that the state, when they adopted the California Water Code, they didn't give us the Gold Star program. They gave us enforcement authority. You know, and that's the tool we have. That's really the tool that we use. Certainly, you know, we're happy to engage anybody who wants to work with us. That's not necessarily a problem. We definitely encourage people to comment on basically any of our board actions. I we have one coming up next month, I don't recall the exact date, but we have them regularly, and we're happy to hear anybody's perspectives. But that being said, that a wastewater discharge is a wastewater discharge. You know, fundamentally, we all use water to eliminate waste, either as individual